Hi, I'm Justin Stairs, and today I'm going to analyze The Lamp at Noon by Sinclair Ross. So this short story opens up with one of the main characters, Ellen, lighting a lamp in the middle of the day, surrounded by dust and wind, even though she is inside her house. And the rest of the story goes on to explain why she is doing this very unnatural thing. Ellen is afraid but will not act. She is docile while she waits for her husband Paul to return from working out in the fields. Ellen is a distressed new mother who is desperately trying to keep her baby alive as the dust slowly suffocates them all. Husband and wife have been fighting for days now on their desperate need to leave the farm. Ellen wants to leave, but Paul is too stubborn and will not leave his sacred land. Ellen cries, "I'm afraid, Paul. I can't stand it any longer. He cries all the time. You will go, Paul. Say you will. We aren't living here." Not really living. That was on page 3. Ellen wants him to come and work for her father at his shop, but again, Paul's pride gets in the way of that, and he simply won't do it. Ellen then goes on to accuse him of farming improperly, and they just continue to fight with each other until Paul storms out. Ellen panics and pleads to her husband to stay with her, but Paul, trying to be manly in this situation, leaves her in her time of need and goes back outside to work more in the fields. A little while later, we see Paul come back towards the house, trying, in my opinion, to make amends, but he only ever gets as far as the window. He sees Ellen pacing back and forth with her baby in her arms, contemplating what her next move will be. Paul then returns to the tool shed and spends the rest of the day there planning all of these great ideas and all of these ways that he's going to make, he's going to be a great farmer again, the land's going to come back, how he's going to convince his wife to stay here. It's going to be great. But when the storm finally subsides, the reality that Paul has been running from this whole time strikes him. There's not a single blade of wheat in his field. Desert. Her voice ran through his head. "Desert, you fool. The lamp lit at noon." And that was on Sinclair's page 7. But still, Paul won't give up his connection to his land. Still, alone, he is trying to come up with a way to win the argument with Ellen, but I don't really think you can win this. So when he finally returns to the house to try and make amends, he sees the doors open, the lamp blown out, and the baby's crib empty and his wife gone. Paul rallies up the neighbors and they all go out to try and find Ellen because initially he has no idea where she has gone. Paul does find Ellen though, sheltering herself from the sand, and he now sees their lifeless baby in her arms. Unfortunately, Paul can tell by Ellen's smile and tone that she was broken before she left this afternoon. All her constant isolation and captivity, being crammed up in that house for so long, she has lost her mind. Ellen is still holding her lifeless baby in her arms, and she seems to be fine with it. So it is at this point that we know Ellen is gone. Ironically, the storm finally does subside, and Ellen, with a smile, goes, "You were right, Paul. You said tonight we'd see the storm go down. So still now, and a red sky. It means tomorrow it will be fine." That was on page 9. This statement I found really is meant to mock Paul and his foolish pride, because at this point, it's too late to save their family. So a little biographical info about Sinclair Ross. He was born in 1908, so he actually experienced firsthand the desolation and despair of the Great Depression. Most of the stories written by Sinclair Ross are set in the Canadian prairies because he grew up in Saskatchewan, so he had it firsthand and he had a pretty good idea of what was going on. So the setting, the short story is set in the Canadian prairies during the Great Depression in the 1930s, as we just mentioned. The atmosphere is very dark and grim, and it is narrated to us in the third-person omnipresent view. That way we know what Paul and Ellen and what they are thinking at the same time. So a little background context for this story. I found that it was important to note that the setting of the prairies during the Great Depression is central to the feeling of despair and utter isolation that Ellen experiences in this story, because I don't feel this story would have been successful had it been set anywhere else. Also, being set in the 1930s, Ellen didn't really have any mode of transportation to, leave the farmer and leave Paul and take she had no way of contacting the outside world. Perhaps, if she'd had a cell phone or the internet like we have in modern day, her family could have been saved. So the characters in this, you have Paul, who is the stubborn, unsupportive husband who's stuck in his ways and feels that this is the life he was meant to live, and this is what he's gonna do, and he'll fix it no matter what. But at the end of the day, it wasn't something that could be done, and his stubbornness ultimately dooms his family. There's also Ellen, though, and she's the timid, fearful wife of Paul, and she's also the mother to this baby, but she's too weak to make a stand to Paul, and so I would say that also has a little bit to do with their family's ultimate doom. Of course, there's the baby, and I found that the baby was also the dust to Ellen and Paul's wind. And when I say that, I mean that, the baby was the casualty, so the casualty would have been the dust, to Ellen and Paul's wind, which was actually their battles. With those two battling, going back and forth, they couldn't make a decision, and in the end, they lose their child. I found that the main theme in The Lamp Lit at Noon was that the isolation of the prairies and what it can do to the human mind and spirit, I feel that really comes to the forefront in this story as they really try to stress, isolation and captivity, what it can do to somebody, what it can do to someone's mind, someone's spirit. And you see that with Ellen a lot, and in the end, she ends up losing her mind, and there's really nothing you can do to save them at this point. That family is basically broken. A little bit of imagery. I found that the dust and suffocation reflects how Ellen really felt. Her life is smothering her will to live because she's not really living, as she quoted earlier. The dust equals the despair, and it's just trying to snuff out her humanity. There were two types of wind in the story I found in terms of symbolism. There was the strong wind that they talked about, and I felt that the strong wind was Paul. The wind that pursued, furious the other winds shook the wall. That was on page 2. The fleeing wind I felt would be Ellen, the wind that fled, the wind that sought refuge in the whimpering eaves in fear. In the eaves whimpering in fear. That was on page 2. But I also felt that the lamp, which is the whole part of the story, I felt that symbolized their hope or their spark of humanity. But when Paul comes back and sees that Ellen and her baby and their baby is gone and the lamp is blown out, I feel like that at that point the reader really knows that all hope is lost. This short story also made me think of a few connections that I could make, to the world as well as my personal life. So the connection to my personal life that I made, when I was reading about Ellen's struggles of isolation and captivity, I kind of thought, it made me think back a little while to when we had a great ice storm here, 3-4 years ago. All of our power was out. We had no service, no heat. The only thing that kept us warm was our wood fireplace that we have downstairs, and a small generator kept the fridge going. Now, I wouldn't say that my story is the same as Ellen's, but I felt that I could relate to her just in terms of feeling isolated, because after 3 days, we were starting to get riled up, We wanted to go outside, but we couldn't due to the frigid cold and ice. And you start feeling, desperate. You're hoping for something to happen. But, obviously, I knew that we were going to be okay because we knew that the storm would pass. But still, I felt that was something that I could really, connect to her on a deeper level and feel, kind of feel her pain. A connection to the world that I made was, like the southern U.S. and the Caribbean, with all those hurricanes that have just come now. I feel that feeling of despair and helplessness is really kind of central in the story, because I couldn't imagine to be trapped inside your house while, constant rain beats down, lots of wind, things like that. To even think about that is horrible. But I felt that the author's goal was to give us a glimpse of how harsh it really was to live back in that time. Great Depression, dust, failing crops, things like that. He wanted to make us aware of the negative effects on the human spirit and mind. When you're isolated, here's what can happen to a person. It could destroy us, or it can save you. And that was a twist that I found in the story, that perhaps if their family had stayed together, maybe they could have rode out the storm, but both Paul and Ellen suffered alone. And in the end, their family was broken. But both, they couldn't overcome that isolation. So in the end, it didn't work out. Thank you.